All right. You ready for our next excellent speaker? I had a good time with this guy the other night. We were actually discussing movies over a lot of tacos and enchiladas and salsa. And yeah, right? I noticed that Bastrop has like 20 Mexican restaurants and like one, that's it. There's like one other restaurant. Now, Olav, I thought I knew a lot about movies, but Olav put me to shame. He was telling me stuff that I had never heard of and didn't know anything about. So I think you're going to find a lot more depth and interesting connections that Olav's going to make. His piece is Something Wicked This Way Comes, the secret space program's end game, or the secret space program, what is the end game? So give a great, warm, hearty welcome for Olav Phillips.
All right, I would be remiss if I didn't start my clock. I don't want to go too long. Thank you for coming this morning. I know the clocks are reset. Before I get to too much, hang on. See if I can get my slides to show up. Before I get to too much, I do want to apologize. I'm an engineer. I'm a researcher. I am not a public speaker. So I'll do my best. Oops, see? A bit closer, okay. See, they're already telling me where to stand. Who am I? Like everybody else, I put up the CV of who I am. You can read that if you want to. Basically, I write stuff, I go on radio shows, and I come up with theories. Before I begin, this is a slide I put into every slide deck I've ever done. It's something I firmly believe. Don't believe me or anybody else up here. Don't believe anybody. Do it yourself. Anything that I'm going to tell you is a starting point. It's a starting point only. I want you to go out and take the time to actually figure it out for yourself. Okay, what is the secret space program? Excuse me, I have to read this. To me, I define the secret space fundamentally as a theory backed up by facts that a parallel space program exists outside the view or control of the populace. It exists in a multinational space and is supported by most industrialized nations and is controlled by a parallel government structure which exists that we don't see. So one of the questions I get asked a lot when I do radio shows, and when I talk to people, is it aliens? Now, some of you may believe it is, some of you may not. It's open to conjecture. Nobody really knows. That's the truth. I'm going to give it to you straight, and nobody can tell you one way or the other. I have my own personal belief, and I will attempt to prove that to you. What I do, though, is that I utilize Occam's razor. This is a very, very old idea. And dumbing it down, I think Ptolemy put it best, that he says, we consider a good principle to explain phenomenon by the simplest hypothesis possible. Meaning that the more complex that you make something, the less likely it is that it's true. That being said, there are UFOs, and some of them may be alien. This is a very famous photo from McMinnville in the 50s. This is a more controversial shot from apparently Apollo 20. We can talk about that later if anybody wants to, but I enjoy it. This is also Apollo 20. The thing that always struck me about this is the iconography. I studied anthropology, and the iconography always gets me. I'm always looking for iconography because as humans, we tag things. It's just our nature. If you have a bomber, you put a picture of your girlfriend or your wife on the side of it, you name it after her, right? We name cars, we name boats, we name airplanes. Stephen Colbert has an airplane. Oh, you got that. Virgin America. But again, what's interesting about this one, they do, it's called the Colbert. So if you look at the iconography here, this is very Mayan, right? So if this is alien, this is very Mayan. That's very interesting. So who is it and what's the point? That's basically why I'm here. I don't think it's aliens. Welcome to Alternative 3, the blueprint for the end of the world. Alternative 3 is probably the most dangerous television show ever made. But why? Alternative 3 was the final episode in a long-running East Anglia television show. It was a hard science show called Science Report. It was intended for broadcast April 1st. That date's important. April 1st, 1977. It was actually aired June 20th, 1977 due to scheduling conflicts. There was a strike, people were confused. They aired it in June. Sorry. It was simulcast in 3 countries and caused a widespread panic, leading to legislation to prevent Alternative 3 from being re-aired. It was shown in Australia and subsequently banned. At the same time it was shown, it was optioned by NBC Drama. The head of NBC was in London at the time and caught an airing of it. He optioned it, meaning he bought rights to it, brought it back to America. He showed it to NBC Standards and Practices, which subsequently said that it was too dangerous to air. The only country, actually, that it can be aired on television is Japan, and is shown approximately once a year in Japan. It was directed by Christopher Miles, who became very famous in England. It was written by David Ambrose, who also became very famous. For anybody who likes ambient electronica, the soundtrack was done by Brian Eno, who's extremely famous. And it was on Music for Films. So if you go watch it, it's on YouTube. If you like the soundtrack, Music for Films. It's Alternative 3. One of the other interesting aspects, and this actually came out while I was talking to Joseph Farrell, he asked me what the pedigree was basically of the people who made the show. And the show was made by East Anglia Television. I didn't put this in. It was made by East Anglia Television, which was later acquired by ITV. ITV is owned by Rupert Murdoch. So for many of you, that should not be a surprise. So Alternative 3. It was presented by a man named Tim Brenton, who later became a member of Parliament and who was a well-respected TV presenter. So he was a news presenter, and what that means that he was basically a news host. So if you think of the guy sitting at the desk reading you the news, i.e. Walter Cronkite, that was Tim Brenton. In the UK, you cannot be a news presenter or a newscaster and be an actor. That may have changed now, but back then you couldn't be. And it was to precisely avoid what Alternative 3 did. That when you watch it, you think it's real because the guy telling you is the same guy who's on the BBC telling you the news. So what happened was that Tim Brenton actually left being a news presenter. He became an actor, did Alternative 3, and then went back to being a newscaster. Go figure. The show ostensibly dealt with the brain drain, which occurred in the UK in the 1970s. Many scientists and technicians were leaving the UK for greener pastures. During the filming, the researchers discover a secret plan to leave the Earth. Mayhem ensues as we learn the Earth will soon no longer be able to support life. But wait, the government is here to fix the problem. It has been claimed that it is a mockumentary, and it's not real. The people in it are actors, but it is a blueprint. The structure is fundamentally correct. Excuse me. In the film, Professor Ballantyne tells us that in 1957, there was a secret meeting where noted scientists became convinced that soon the Earth would experience climate instability and plunge into an ice age, and the world would effectively end. Now, in the film, when you watch this, when they talk about this, Ballantyne is a arrogant, egocentric professor type, and they're walking down this hallway. You can actually see it here. My laser pointer's working. You can see it here. Very a la Cambridge, Oxford. As they're talking about this, they start to show B-roll. For people who don't make movies or TV, B-roll is kind of like filler, and they're showing films of deserts and dead animals and ice ages and rains, and they're talking about, this place experienced flooding. Hey, we experienced flooding here. This, flooding, and this place is having no rain, and et cetera. So they're doing all this to reinforce it dramatically. Incidentally, in 1957, there was a meeting of the American Chemical Society in which a guy named Roger Revelle, who worked for the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, discovered oceans could process a mere 10% of the CO2 being generated in 1957. Now, his area of study was phytoplankton, and phytoplankton is often referred to as the CO2 scrubbers of the ocean. That we have this assumption that there's this huge mass of phytoplankton out in the ocean that's processing the CO2 that's being generated naturally, not naturally, whatever, but it's processing it. Well, in 57, he discovered that it wasn't. In short, we had a problem. As Revelle wrote, human beings are now carrying out a large-scale geophysical experiment of a kind that could not have happened in the past nor be reproduced in the future. An experiment which would lead to large-scale greenhouse effects, which would heat up the entire planet, amongst other things. In effect, Revelle had discovered global warming in 1957. So what does alternative 3 tell us? Remember, I said the government's here to help. So the date of 1957 obviously wasn't a coincidence. They came out of that meeting with 3 main alternatives. There we go. Alternative 1, to set off a high-altitude nuclear device to blow a hole in the atmosphere and vent CO2 into space. Nobody's laughing yet. Okay, thank you. So it sounds insane. They really did try it. I'll get to that in a second. It sounds completely insane, but these are the same guys that came up with plowshares, where they wanted to use high-yield nuclear weapons to build harbors and to make canals. And they actually carried out a test in Alaska. They set off a nuclear device, and they created a beautiful harbor, beautiful deep harbor. The problem is you can't use it for 10,000 years. The second alternative, I call it alternative 1.5, is geoengineering on a mass scale. The second alternative, or the third alternative actually, build massive underground bunkers. The alternative 3, leave by way of the moon to go to Mars to recolonize until the Earth is stabilized. Now, one thing you're probably asking yourself right about now is that where do I fit into this? You don't. Alternative 1, set off a high-yield, high-altitude nuclear device. Welcome to Project Argus. It's actually hardtack Argus, if anybody wants to look it up. Hardtack. In 1958, just 1 year after the supposed meeting, Task Force 88 was formed to execute Project Argus Hardtack Argus Floral. It also has the name Floral. I thought that was funny. Its mission was to fire 2 missiles into the upper atmosphere near the geologic equator at the highest over 4,000 miles up to detonate a 2-kiloton nuclear device to create an artificial radiation belt similar to the Van Allen radiation belt, which protects our planet from radiation. The project was completed within 6 months, where normal projects took over 2 years. Now I want to get into that for a second. These projects, when you want to assemble a task force, anybody who's ever been in the Navy would probably know this, that you don't just assemble a task force. It just doesn't work that way. You've got dozens of ships. Each ship has to have a specialty. I get more into it in the book, but each ship literally had a specialty. The ships that went out there, they had the latest radar. They had the latest of all these technologies. These were the most high-tech ships that we could front from a scientific point of view. So 6 months is not long. That's short. The other thing that I want to point out about Hardtack Argus is that when they carried it out in 1958, it was hailed as one of the greatest experiments ever carried out in the history of science, because they did successfully create the artificial Van Allen radiation belt. The problem is that the guys who were saying that it was the greatest experiment ever were read into the project, and they were government scientists. because this project was classified until the 80s. That makes you wonder what they were really doing out there. So from an alternative 3 point of view, this project was a failure, because obviously blowing a hole in the atmosphere and venting carbon dioxide is asinine. Welcome to alternative 1.5, geoengineering on a massive scale. So it's actually global dimming, but it's what you guys call chemtrails. The notion is very simple, that you enter material into the upper atmosphere to reflect light back into space. This lowers the temperature of the Earth, and it changes the overall albedo or reflectivity of the Earth. This is ongoing. This is a patent. This is patent 5,104,069. This was issued to Boeing. Boeing's important because they build 7 X-7 aircraft, 737s, 747s, 757s, 777s, 787s, Boeing. The apparatus shown is a method for injecting a material from an aircraft, basically a sprayer. The release mechanism could be coupled with a device to filter material out from the fuel, then eject it into the air where it mixes with the contrail. One of the things that's interesting in chemtrail research is that nobody's ever found the fleet. Now you're talking about a fleet of aircraft that are covering large cities across the entire world. It takes a fleet of aircraft to do that. Nobody's ever found it. To my knowledge, nobody's ever found a pilot who says that they're actually a chemtrail pilot who can prove it. There are photos that float around of a spraying plane where you see the inside of the fuselage. And what you're going to see is a whole bunch of tanks connected by tubes and then a pumping device. That's not chemtrail spraying. That's actually testing the balance of the aircraft when they're testing its flight dynamics. So what I would posit to you is that the material is mixed into the jet fuel and that the pilots don't know they're spraying it. Now, I know what I'm saying might be controversial to some of you, but here's the proof. It's a little hard to see, but if you look at this graph, you'll see that it's jagged, but that's okay. If you deal with a lot of graphs and performance characteristics of things, I'm an IT engineer, so I see graphs like this all the time. The jagged is okay, but what you're looking for is a linear pattern. And it's a linear pattern that shows the temperature of the surface of the Earth is linearly increasing. It's not what we call hockey sticking. It's just linearly increasing, okay? But what's important here is that you see the temperature, and this is the 1800s, and let's remember what Walter Bosley was talking about. So you see the 1800s here, you see industrialization, you see it start to increase. Goes along fairly steady. Then right around late 1950s, 1960, it plummets, okay? And then you see it rises, and then it's a little hockey sticky, and then it drops, and then now this jaggedness that you see is probably error correction. When you're carrying out a global spraying program, right, you're going to make mistakes because we're all human. So this is them attempting to correct the mistakes, right? Or this is because of outside influence, be it a volcano, whatever. But this is the part that I want to point out is right here. This is right about the same time that Roger Revelle revealed that we were no longer processing things with the phytoplankton. This is what it looks like. Now, one interesting thing of note is that a lot of times people think, I'm interested by chemtrails, right? And everybody's going to think I'm crazy. You know, I go out and I tell my friends, see all those persistent contrails? They're going to think I'm nuts. Actually, I saw a BET interview with Prince. If anybody, you guys listen to Prince. Prince actually said in a BET interview that over Minneapolis, where he's from, that he noticed starting in the 1970s that the persistent contrails started to form. That's Prince. He's famous, and he said it on BET. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cough. The other thing that's important about this, and I was having a conversation about this just earlier with Joseph Farrell, But one of the things that you'll notice is that the most dense concentration of this kind of geoengineering occurs over population centers. And people are trying to understand why. Well, the answer to that is simple. One of the things that you notice about this kind of scenario is that as more light passes through and hits the earth, if it hits a cornfield and it hits dirt, the dirt absorbs it and it kind of dissipates. But if it hits a city, there's a thing called the heat island effect, where the concrete soaks up the heat and radiates it back out. The way that this manifests is that here in Ballstrop, this is a fairly population undense place. There's a lot of dirt. So the temperature here, on average, would probably be anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees lower than if you went into Austin, where there's a lot of concrete. So that's why you see more dense spraying over population centers, because that they're trying to offset that heat island effect. The other thing that's important about global dimming, and that's actually its name. If you Google global dimming, you'll find it. In the days after 9/11, right, they grounded all the aircraft in the United States, basically in North America. A lot of scientists became very excited, atmospheric scientists, and they went outside and they said, oh no, or oh yes, actually. They grounded all the aircraft, let's float some balloons and see what's going on. And the skies were clear, no chemtrails, right? Geoengineering. So they found that the temperature actually rose over a 5 or 7-day period by a degree or more, and that the ambient light hitting the surface of the earth increased dramatically. It was much brighter. So global dimming is actually a very real thing. There are plenty of graphs that you can look at. There's plenty of science data about it. And not all science data is bad. You know, in the case of global dimming, it's pretty good. Sorry about that. Alternative 2, build massive underground bases. I don't think anyone here needs to be told that we are building massive underground bases. COG, or continuity of government construction, has progressed at an alarming rate for almost 50 years or more. But the status is a failure. Now, why is that a failure? The answer is simple. You cannot build enough bunkers fast enough to hold 350 million people, and that's in the United States alone. But what it is there's enough to hold the people with the money. We'll get to that in a minute. This is Site R. This is Raven Rock. This is one of the really big ones. One of the features that I like most about this COG bunker is it has a Starbucks. So when you hit the end of the world, if you need a latte, they got you covered. There's also a gift shop, so I'm assuming that you can get t-shirts. Well, you have to figure you're going to live subterraneally for 10 to 20 years. You know, you need Starbucks and you need t-shirts. This is FEMA. This is Mount Weather. This is one of the largest underground bunkers in existence. It's Virginia. And actually, I'm nervous, so it escapes me right now. But there's a COG facility that was that's under a hotel out there, and I think it's in West Virginia. You can actually tour it. Yeah, it's impressive. But the key to what you want to look for with underground bunkers is not underground bunkers. The DUMBs, the deep underground military bunkers that you're looking for, are continuity of government facilities, COGs. Look for COGs. This is Svalbard. This is the global seed vault. And I would ask you, if nothing's wrong, why do we have a seed vault? Way north. It's a very complex facility. It's very cold. They store a lot of seeds. This is the airfield next to Svalbard. It's pretty big. So you can land a pretty decent sized aircraft there. Now, if Svalbard was alone, I might think to myself, well, they're trying to store non-GMO seeds. So who knows, maybe somebody at Monsanto goes crazy and genetically mismodifies some seeds to die on demand or whatever. So they want to build something like Svalbard, to protect that, to keep what they call heritage seeds, right? Heirloom as well. It's not the only one. This is the Millennium Seed Bank in West Sussex, UK. Most of the seed vault is actually underground. This is what you can see on Google Earth. This is the Institute of Plant Industry, St. Petersburg, in the Russian Federation. This is the National Center for Genetic Resource Preservation. I like the name. Fort Collins, Colorado. And look, this one has a track, in case you want to run. Now, the important part about this is that as you look at all these facilities, these are all over the world. US, Russian Federation, UK, Scandinavia. And this is not all of them. These are the big ones. There's approximately 14 more small ones. I didn't want to load up my presentation with satellite photos of seed vaults, so I just stopped at these. But there are 14 more. In fact, the one in the Philippines was destroyed when Mount Pinatubo went off. So again, there are a bunch of these. So let's get to Elon Musk. I like Elon Musk. I'm an engineer, and I appreciate what he's doing for STEM, for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It's something that we as a culture need to focus on. We need more engineers, we need more scientists, more technicians, and more mathematicians. We don't do a good job of training them. But how do you move things covertly? That's one of the big problems of the secret space program or any kind of covert operations. How do you move things covertly? An underground rail system would be a fantastic way to do it. But is it possible? I mean, really possible. I'm not standing up here telling you things that are impossible. I'm telling you things that are possible. Elon Musk has proposed a high-speed vacuum-sealed rail system between San Francisco and Los Angeles. I'm sure you guys have read about it. Achieves a speed of somewhere around 14,000 miles an hour. You can do San Francisco to Los Angeles in like half an hour, something like that. But he wasn't the first. This is a high-speed rail network proposed by R.M. Stiller of the Rand Corporation, August 1972. Now you'll notice the yellow line is the main line. Right here. Yeah, all the big ones. This pattern will be important in a little bit. So kind of commit this kind of shape to memory, okay? I'll get to that in a minute. So then you'll see that there are stub lines that come off of it. Dallas, Houston, New Orleans, Jacksonville. You'll see these stub lines. In fact, there's a huge stub line that goes up to Portland and Seattle. The green dots basically represent terminals of some sort. But these big yellow ones, that's the main line. Yeah. Now, Stiller said that he could achieve speeds as high as 14,000 miles an hour in the studies that he did, which means that you could do New York to Los Angeles in 21 minutes. But how big of a train could you build? Small, big? This is a nuclear-powered borer. This is what they use to build cog facilities and underground rail networks. I'll just let you look at that for a second. That's really big. And they're very efficient, and they use them quite a bit. One of the theories that I heard is that the Taos hum that a lot of people have heard is actually caused by a rail line, stub line that goes under Taos. Now we're going to get to the fun stuff. I think this part's fun. Alternative 3, leave by way of the moon and to Mars to recolonize. This is the genesis of the secret space program as we understand it. Nothing less than the evacuation of select individuals to Mars by way of the moon, and it's happening now. Now, one of the things that a lot of people want to discuss is why. What's going to happen? I don't know. I'm not here to tell you that. I'm just here to tell you what they're doing. Possible options: climatic collapse due to thermonuclear warfare, most unlikely, I think of a lot. Climate change due to various factors, including natural cycles, probably pretty far up there. Asteroid impact, i.e. Apophis, in 2036, 2068. Could be likely. Something we don't know about? Very likely. Now, what's interesting is about Apophis, this guy, right? There's a fantastic interview with Neil deGrasse Tyson where he goes through what would happen if Apophis hits what's called a keyhole. I think it's like a 100-kilometer window. Depending on where it hits in that window is depending on how much damage it's going to do. If it hits it nail on, then it's going to sandblast the West Coast. But what I always tell people is pick your favorite theory. This is the M project. This is the genesis of Alternative 3. Commissioned in 1940 by Franklin Roosevelt as a black project. And he actually called it a black project with $180,000. Now that's $3.1 million adjusted for inflation. So that tells you how much money we've lost since 1940. It was led by a very famous, totally rich anthropologist by the name of Henry Fields. Henry Fields is Fields Museum in Chicago, Fields Department Store, amongst other things. Fields employed 32 researchers and several secretaries, and it's actually interesting that they break it apart. FDR's purpose was to study the relocation of large populations due to war, famine, or climatic event, because the disconnected can and will cause trouble, serious trouble. No climate was considered too harsh for evaluation, and they went everywhere from the British Congo to places in Russia. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. The eventual conclusion is what's actually very interesting, is that according to the M Project, which sat on a shelf for a long time, they suggested moving to Mars or Venus because Alpha Centauri was too far. I like that. So this is the moon. We all see it most nights, cloud cover permitting, or if it's a new moon. But it's a very interesting place. Moon bases. I know this is what everybody wanted. Moon bases sounds crazy, right? But it's not. Project Horizon, a U.S. Army project to build a moon base by 1967. Now remember these dates and compare them to the Apollo. The Apollo mission. The base would have offensive and defensive capabilities and was staffed by a crew of over 200 specially trained Army soldier astronauts by 1965. Again, as we have seen, the project was publicly killed off, but that doesn't mean that it stopped. Not to be outdone by the Army, the Air Force had their own plan called Project Lunex. Lunex was the Air Force plan. It called for a crew of 21 to live in an underground defense station at a cost of $7.5 billion. The interesting part of the project is that it predated the Apollo program, and in operation would explain why moon hoax theories exist. Not to be outdone, the Soviets came up with their own plan, Zvezda. Zvezda had the hallmarks of Horizon and Lunex. One of the differences is that in Horizon, the Army, being the Army, they wanted to take the fuel tanks of the vehicles that they used to get there, and they wanted to bury them and then use them like bunkers. The Air Force Lunex program actually had more of a landing component. So it had a main ship that would land on struts vertically, and then the people would get out, build a moon base, but they would live in this structure, this ship on struts, until they had completed the moon base. Zvezda was more of the model of Horizon, where they wanted to reutilize the fuel tanks to build underground bunkers. A lot of underground bunkers. So what about transient lunar phenomenon? For anybody who's not familiar, TLP is marked by light spontaneously appearing on the surface of the moon, and it's been seen by reputable scientists. This map shows an example of TLP reports on the near side of the moon. It should also be noted that TLPs have been reported since the 1800s, but most likely that was caused by atmospheric or misidentification. As you can see, there are a lot of them, and they grow. And they happen now, and they continue to happen to this day. So if I'm going to tell you that there are people on the moon, I should be able to prove that, right? Those are tracks. That's a vehicle. You can see the tracks. There's more tracks over in here. This is supposedly a lunar mining unit. This is the URL if you want to go download it yourself. By the way, I'm going to make my slide deck publicly available. You guys can download it off the website in a couple days. No problem. This is another track. After the lecture, if anybody can tell me what that is besides a track, let me know. But that's a track. That I can't tell you. It's pretty big though. And if you think about the moon, mining would be great because supposedly there's titanium, there's helium-3 for power. There's a whole bunch of exotic minerals up there. So it'd be fantastic to mine it. Most long-term programs like Horizon and Lunex assume some level of mining to sustain activities on the moon. Back then, they weren't talking about helium-3 as a power source, but today they talk about helium-3 as a power source. But they definitely wanted to get the titanium and some of the other materials out of the moon and to smelt it. But let's not stop at the moon. We got to go to Mars, right? Because that's where we're all going to end up. Well, some of us. I call that the facility. You can't see it. It's right there. Now, when you download the image here, this sticks out like a sore thumb. One of the things that you'll notice when you look at the high-resolution image not projected, if you blow it up, there's a lot of texture. Because rock and sand, which is Mars, has a lot of texture. You can see it all around here. This is perfectly smooth. And in the high-resolution photo, not projected, you can see there's actually a reflection here, and that this circular thing is a dome, but there's actually light reflection from it. This is the Mars monolith. Here's the URL. Try to remember that. Again, if anybody can tell me what that is that's naturally occurring, I'm all ears. They call this the Mars Monolith Graveyard. There's the URL. Malin Space Sciences, my favorite guys. Now, one of the other things that's called for in the alternative 3 scenario, since we're talking about the moon and Mars, is this notion of batch consignments. Batch consignments are basically people that are kidnapped, taken to the moon and Mars to function as slave labor. That's how we do things. So what you see here is a composite of 2 maps. The bottom map, the one with all the marks on it, that's by David Paulides, or Paulides, I'm sorry. I always butcher his name, and he's a fantastic researcher. But he documents disappearances in national parks. So what you see there is disappearances in national parks. What you see overlaid on top of it, these lines, it doesn't show up well, but these lines are actually, these are the states, right? And you see this line right here? If I wasn't so nervous, I'd do it straight. This is a rail network, and then these circles are terminals. This one's an anomaly. I got to figure that one out. But if you look in a lot of these areas where there are a lot of disappearances, pretty close by there's a terminal. So what does that tell you? It tells you that people disappear and they go into the rail terminal and they really disappear. And one of the interesting things, I was talking to Jay Widener about this, that that a lot of these disappearances that Paulides, sorry, I apologize, David. A lot of the disappearances that he's shown are either people that have no reason for disappearing, they're just common people, they're mechanics or they work on HVAC or whatever, and then there are people with high IQs. The people with high IQs are not batch consignments, they're recruited. Now in alternative 3, this is shown, there's a scientist that they follow. One day, she tells her family, hey, I'm gonna go for a trip. She drives to Heathrow, she leaves her car in the parking lot, leaves her wallet, leaves her keys, takes her bag, and she's gone, never to reappear. this actually happens, and it happens in these spots. Scientists, people with high IQs, like north of 150, 160, they happen here. The other thing you have to remember about this map, when you look at anomalies like this, is that this map is from 1990. So this map is 25 years old. So chances are that here, they built another terminal. Right. But let's not stop at the moon or Mars. Let's talk about space stations. There are two main space stations that I can kind of prove to you. One is called the MOLE, the Manned Observation Lab. It was an Air Force project to build and later deploy a manned battle station equipped with a laser. The two-man crew, both Air Force astronauts, and yes, the Air Force does have its own separate astronaut corps that's not NASA. They were designated to spend 6 months aboard and to function in a capacity of a battle station. The Almaz is the Russian version. This for sure went into space. It had a cannon, 23 millimeter cannon. I actually knew a guy in the Russian space program who was telling me about how they had to re-engineer the thrusters to counteract the recoil of the cannon when they'd fire it because they fired it. This is my favorite, and I dedicate this to Jay Dyer. That's Hugo Drax's space station, right there, seen in a SOHO image. That's a U.S. Air Force NASA concept from 1960. If you can tell me what's naturally occurring about that, I would love to talk to you. So how do we get there? And this is the big question that everybody wants to answer. As everybody's pointed out, there are competing theories about how we get there. You have multiple breakaway civilizations. You have multiple groups within breakaway civilizations. The Nazis are one of them. I don't know how much detail I need to go into about this. I think you guys have probably already all read Joseph Farrell's excellent work, or Igor Witowski, Nick Cook. But the guy you want to talk about is this guy, Hans Kammler. Hans Kammler ran the program. These are very dense slides. I'm going to kind of go through it super quick. I recommend you download them when I upload them because his background's very interesting. Because Kammler, a lot of times when we talk about Kammler, we just say, well, he's a Nazi general and he ran the Bell program at Der Riese. I'm going to butcher all the German. I'm sorry, I speak Spanish. But he ran the program at Der Riese, the giant. He was an ardent Nazi. He was a very bad person. And he had a PhD in engineering, so that's why he did it. That's wrong. Well, it's all right, but that's not why. His engineering degree was in civil engineering, but what he was an ardent Nazi. I mean, through and through. When you talk about some of the terrible things that the SS did, Kammler was actually assigned to destroy the Warsaw Ghetto, if you're familiar with World War II history. He actually was personally assigned by Himmler to destroy the Warsaw Ghetto, and he kept meticulous notes of everything that he did. He later unseated Göring as the head of special weapons projects, and he built Peenemünde, Nordhausen. He was in charge of these facilities, and he built them. He was also highly efficient, which explains his diverse use of labor in the scientist pool in the development of the Bell. So I'm not even going to try to read all that to you guys. You're just going to get bored. So please download it, and it's in the book. This, of course, is the Bell, the Glocke. I can explain to you how it works if you want to, but you probably already read the book. I put it in here in case you guys have never seen it before, but I assumed you had. This is the henge, supposedly. This is where they would tether the Bell when they tested it. This is where it gets interesting. This is the Haunebu 2, actually, that is supposedly representative of the German flying saucer program powered by the Bell. Now, I want you to remember the shape. I put it in here because this shape becomes very important in a couple minutes. Of course, after the war, we had Project Paperclip. There's Wernher von Braun. hanging out with his friends. There's Werner von Braun hanging out with his friends. Oh, he was a mainstay in Disney. When Disney went out and did the programming around the conquest of space and all this, Werner von Braun was a mainstay telling you how the space program works, because he already knew, because he built it. All right. Then a few years later, we get this stuff. This is George Adamski, probably fake, but look at the shape. How would Adamski know what that's supposed to look like? I ask you. Interesting thing about the contactee era is, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Again, a few years later, we have a different type. They're constantly evolving and changing. But the Haunebu type is very specific, and that will become important in just a moment. We also have this, the T-588. This is the lenticular reentry vehicle. This thing's bizarre. But it came out at about the same time that the Air Force was developing a lot of things. And they were all developed by these guys. Who developed that? Oops. All right. So what happened to Kamler? That's the big, $64,000 question, or adjusted for inflation, $64 million question. What happened to him and the other guys after the war? They went off the farm. Maybe they went off the planet. I think we see competing interests. On one hand, I believe we have found over time that there is a Nazi or Nazi 2.0 component, which is extraplanetary, but there is also an Earth-based component as well, both breakaway civilizations. This would explain SDI systems, which are in orbit. This would explain armed battle stations and the Solar Warden Space Navy. One important thing to talk about with SDI, I spoke to an SDI engineer. Always happens this way, the last 5 minutes of a radio show I was on called Ground Zero, and he called in and he said, hey, I'm a aerospace engineer from the Pacific Northwest, and I worked on a program in the mid-1970s, and I was guarded by federal marshals. And he said the program that he worked on was to build a constellation of three satellites. One was a hunter-killer, and two were laser platforms that circled the globe equatorially. The hunter-killer was actually mobile. It'd move itself around using some sort of rudimentary AI system. This is important because he said he put it into orbit in 1977. By the way, in case you haven't seen it, this is from a movie called Iron Sky, and that would be predictive programming. One of the other important things is that we always ask is, where did Kamler go? There have been persistent rumors of a thing called Base 211 that exists in Antarctica, a place called New Schwabenland, which is where the German and Nazi Arctic expeditions went, but nobody can seem to figure out how they got there. This is a map, shows you the rough straight line. Remember, shortest distance, 2 points, straight line, but it's curved for the curvature of the Earth. It's roughly 10,000 miles. This is how they did it. This is a Junkers 390. It's actually quite a huge plane. You can get an idea because the cockpit's right there. I had a crew of 10. You can see it has a range of roughly 6,000 miles, but that's not 10,000, so we got a problem, right? Here's a solution. There's a thing called a Junkers 290, which is a little smaller, and according to legend, it actually carried out refueling exercises in the August of 1943. Or actually, the 390 was used as a reconnaissance aircraft in August of 1943, and it flew into Canada, but it was refueled by a 290. So the Germans and the Nazis at that time had mid-air refueling. Now, if you look at this map, you got to make 6,000 miles, which is a little over halfway. So we're going to think it's somewhere around Argentina. I know. And remember, they don't have, what happens to the two, remember we're talking about ideologues. So what happens to the 290 after it refuels? It ditches, they run away, probably it relands in certain parts of Argentina, and the people disappear. This is the U-234, another option. This U-234 was originally designed as a mine layer. The Germans had quite a number of different kinds of U-boats, but this was a mine layer that was converted into a cargo U-boat. After the war, well, when the crew of the U-234 found out that the Germans had surrendered, the Nazis had surrendered, they made a beeline for Newport News, Virginia, because they wanted to give up. And on board, when it was captured, I've got to read this part. On board, they found it was carrying a new kind of electric torpedo, a crated Messerschmitt 262, which is the first real jet aircraft, an HS-293 glide bomb, which is kind of like a cruise missile, sort of, like a very simple version, 1,200 pounds of uranium oxide, 50 lead tubes. It was also carrying 1 Luftwaffe general, 4 German naval officer, a large number of scientists and engineers, as well as 2 Japanese naval attachés. The Japanese attachés committed suicide ritually right before they were captured. Its destination was Japan, but it had enough fuel to run for an additional 6 to 9 months. Remember, I was talking about iconography. As humans, we like to label things. It's just our nature. We catalog, we label. Well, we label. This is back in the mid-'70s. There was a article written in Saga, if anybody remembers that magazine. I forget the guy's name. It's in the book, but I forget the guy's name. But he actually went through and cataloged iconography seen on UFOs. These are seen on UFOs. This thing right here is a wolf's angle symbol used by the National Socialist Movement of the Netherlands. This looks like the British Union of Fascists, and it goes on from there. There's more. But the reason why it's important is that neither of these are German, but they're both fascists. What you see is a collection of symbols that are both German and fascist. You see Vichy, French fascists, you see British fascists, Irish fascists. You see all these kinds of symbols on the UFOs, especially around the contactee era. This is interesting. During the contactee era, there's a thing called a Nordic. The Nordics are supposed to stand between 6 and 7 feet tall, blonde hair, blue eye. This is a picture of one with Adamski. Adamski claimed that he met a number of Nordics. This is really interesting. That's Valiant Thor. I think that's Valiant Thor. No, that's Valiant Thor and that's Commander Dawn. I always get them confused, I'm sorry. But there's a bigger question. If I'm an alien, why do I name my son Valiant Thor, brave god of thunder in Norse mythology? That's a good question. Then this is Asket. But you see the representation is always the same. Blonde hair, blue-eyed, 6, 7 feet tall. Now, what's interesting about Valiant Thor here, I'm pretty sure that's Commander Dawn. What's interesting about Valiant Thor is that Valiant Thor went with Frank Strange's, Dr. Frank Strange's. He went to the Pentagon. And you can, if you dig, you can find the entry and exit of these guys from the Pentagon. They really went to the Pentagon. Why? Another question I get asked a lot is about crop circles. What are they? Are they alien? Maybe, maybe not. That's not alien. That's the black sun. The black sun is an occult symbol. This is from Wewelsburg Castle. This is Himmler's headquarters for the SS. This is actually in the floor. This is a crop circle from Wiltshire from August of this year. Now there's one big difference. This right here. I don't know what that is. And it's not present on this. This has one wheel. Well, it has more than one wheel, right? You can see there are interlocking wheels. This has the same interlocking wheels until you get to this part. There's an outer wheel that doesn't exist. But this is a message. This is a message to somebody. Now, Jay Dyer was talking about predictive programming. Like many people of my generation, I play video games. I'm not sorry. I like it. This is a sign I found in the game Wolfenstein: The New Order. Now, I've been playing Wolfenstein since I was a little kid. So I saw the new Wolfenstein came out, and I had to have it. So I'm playing, and at one point you're fighting inside of a museum. It's a museum of science and technology. And I'm going through, killing off the bad guys, and I see this on the wall. So I think to myself, well, I've got to finish the mission first, right? So I nail all the bad guys, and I circle around to this. Now, I'm not even going to attempt the German, but translated it says, next stop Venus, an exhibition about space and how to conquer it. Experience an extraordinary adventure and explore with us the mysterious planet Mars. Oh, wait, I thought it was Venus. Closest our goal. I could have gotten the translation wrong. I think I got that pretty right. This stuff down here is really small. But you can see this is a representation of Venus, rocket, and it was found inside of a Nazi museum in the game of Wolfenstein. Space planes. I'm going to skip all that. This is an interesting one, and it's actually a video. You can find it. I can help you if you want. This is a triangular aircraft. It's not a UFO. It's one of ours. It flies over a star. And as it flies over the star, as it approaches, well, kind of like that, the star shimmers and then is projected on the base of the aircraft. So it actually takes it from above, passes it through, and projects it down below. It's adaptive camouflage. This is a triangular aircraft that was seen out of another plane. Again, it's a video. And you see this triangular aircraft, which you can't really see, it's triangular here, starts weaving in and out of the clouds. This is a high altitude aircraft. No, it's not an A-12. It's too big. It's also not an Aurora. It demonstrates no pulse detonation engine. I think this is an aerospike engine, which has to operate at high altitude and probably could be used for suborbital flights. But these things usually fly about 70,000 feet or more. This is another one seen on a different day. You can see a persistent contrail. Now, the key of why this is not an Aurora, and I've actually seen an Aurora at ECETI, the reason why is because there's no donuts on a rope. There's no pop line, pop line, pop line. So this is a solid contrail that you can see the beginnings of the contrail here. This tends to show that there are two engines, but I think it's an aerospike. This is the quote-unquote Black Knight. I don't think that's an alien. That's another photo of it. This was from an ISS feed before NASA cut the video feed. Now I was talking about iconography. This was seen on a UFO. I didn't know that they could write in English. And that's UN. And this is from 1957. The guy couldn't make out the rest. But Haskell, he saw UN. And there are more. There are red stars. One of them says like UK. I mean, there's a lot of them. We label this stuff. So now in my final minutes, the $64 million question, who's behind it? That's who's behind it. But why? To survive. This is from Forbes. It shows from this year, there are 1,826 billionaires, which is a world record, by the way. This group, distributed by country, controls a total of over $7 trillion. And it actually increased from 6.4 trillion last year. So they made an additional, what, 0.6 trillion and change. So another, 600 billion. But you can see that the distribution is concentrated in the West, but really there are billionaires everywhere. Well, there are chunks of Africa that don't have them, but there are billionaires pretty much everywhere. So what's the end game? Let us assume for the moment that something is coming, whatever it might be. The powers that be know and try to stop it, fix it, mitigate it, and those attempts have failed. They would, of course, tell their friends, and they would, of course, do anything to survive. According to the M Project, and what we have seen ourselves in places like New Orleans, is that society is 3 days away from total breakdown. No food, no water, no structure reduces us to barbarism. The powers that be know this, and they're seeking a way to flee using the $7 trillion, their friends, and special access programs to do it. Snowpiercer. It's actually not that bad of a movie. Very apocalyptic. Alternative 3 is the nuclear option, meaning the worst option. Knowing they cannot sustain their vision of a utopian society, they have instead set a plan in motion with others in and out of various governments to go somewhere and wait it out. Mars seems like the destination for most, but ones left on the Earth will most likely create enclaves of heavily armed and rigid societies while they wait for us to shrink down to the stated 300 million population size in the West, while using less developed countries as forced labor. It's pretty apocalyptic, I know, but I believe it's true. Now, this is important. 300 million, right? Georgia Guidestones, Agenda 21, pick your poison. I think that 300 million represents the West. I think that in less developed parts of the world, they're not trying to decrease the population. They're letting it rise. We can argue that, but I think that you'll see over time that the population indeed rises. So what are my conclusions? What I've shown here today is a model set up by the Alternative 3 film. I've attempted to provide you with a discussion of the means, motive, and opportunity of this parallel group. I have attempted to show Alternative 3 is in progress and what that means. Space Nazis, I think the breakaway civilization has at least 2 factions. The Earthbound group and a more nefarious Nazi group that has been operating out of Base 211 and other locations in South America and maybe other places. War in space, I think as can be seen in STS-48, that a war of some sort is taking place in space. SDI systems such as Project Thor, Brilliant Pebbles, Space Warden, Solar Warden, I left that one out, and others have been deployed to target external threats. Why? Overpopulation, pollution, potential foreknowledge of a catastrophic mass moving in our direction, such as Apophis. It doesn't entirely matter. Take your pick. They're all bad, but it's coming. So I thought I'd end it this way. We've all read this, right? This is, he stated at least twice about how we'd all come together if there are threats from an external source. But this isn't the quote that matters. This quote doesn't matter at all. I would argue to you that whether he said it or not, whether Gorbachev was there or not, it didn't matter. That's the one that matters. That's my presentation. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Olav. One more time. All right. You ready for our next excellent speaker? I had a good time with this guy the other night. We were actually discussing movies over a lot of tacos and enchiladas and salsa. And yeah, right? I noticed that Bastrop has like 20 Mexican restaurants and like one, that's it. There's like one other restaurant. Now, Olav, I thought I knew a lot about movies, but Olav put me to shame. He was telling me stuff that I had never heard of and didn't know anything about. So I think you're going to find a lot more depth and interesting connections that Olav's going to make. His piece is Something Wicked This Way Comes, the secret space program's end game, or the secret space program, what is the end game? So give a great, warm, hearty welcome for Olav Phillips.
If you have a bomber, you put a picture of your girlfriend or your wife on the side of it, you name it after her, right? We name cars, we name boats, we name airplanes. Stephen Colbert has an airplane. Oh, you got that. Virgin America. But again, what's interesting about this one, they do, it's called the Colbert. So if you look at the iconography here, this is very Mayan, right? So if this is alien, this is very Mayan. That's very interesting. So who is it and what's the point? That's basically why I'm here. I don't think it's aliens. Welcome to Alternative 3, the blueprint for the end of the world. Alternative 3 is probably the most dangerous television show ever made. But why? Alternative 3 was the final episode in a long-running East Anglia television show. It was a hard science show called Science Report. It was intended for broadcast April 1st. That date's important. April 1st, 1977. It was actually aired June 20th, 1977 due to scheduling conflicts. There was a strike, people were confused. They aired it in June. Sorry. It was simulcast in 3 countries and caused a widespread panic, leading to legislation to prevent Alternative 3 from being re-aired. It was shown in Australia and is controlled by a parallel government structure which exists that we don't see. So one of the questions I get asked a lot when I do radio shows, and when I talk to people, is it aliens? Now, some of you may believe it is, some of you may not. It's open to conjecture. Nobody really knows. That's the truth. I'm going to give it to you straight, and nobody can tell you one way or the other. I have my own personal belief, and I will attempt to prove that to you. What I do, though, is that I utilize Occam's razor. This is a very, very old idea. And dumbing it down, I think Ptolemy put it best, that he says, we consider a good principle to explain phenomenon by the simplest hypothesis possible. But meaning that the more complex that you make something, the less likely it is that it's true. That being said, there are UFOs, and some of them may be alien. This is a very famous photo from McMinnville in the 50s. This is a more controversial shot from apparently Apollo 20. We can talk about that later if anybody wants to, but I enjoy it. This is also Apollo 20. The thing that always struck me about this is the iconography. I studied anthropology, and the iconography always gets me. I'm always looking for iconography because as humans, we tag things. It's just our nature. Subsequently banned. At the same time it was shown, it was optioned by NBC Drama. The head of NBC was in London at the time and caught an airing of it. He optioned it, meaning he bought rights to it, brought it back to America. He showed it to NBC Standards and Practices, which subsequently said that it was too dangerous to air. The only country, actually, that it can be aired on television is Japan, and it is shown approximately once a year in Japan. It was directed by Christopher Miles, who became very famous in England. It was written by David Ambrose, who also became very famous. For anybody who likes ambient electronica, the soundtrack was done by Brian Eno, who's extremely famous. And it was on Music for Films. So if you go watch it, it's on YouTube. If you like the soundtrack, Music for Films. It's Alternative 3. One of the other interesting aspects, and this actually came out while I was talking to Joseph Farrell, he asked me, what the pedigree was basically of the people who made the show. And the show was made by East Anglia Television. I didn't put this in. It was made by East Anglia Television, which was later acquired by ITV. ITV is owned by Rupert Murdoch. So for many of you, that should not be a surprise. So alternative 3. It was presented by a man named Tim Brenton, who later became a... I would be remiss if I didn't start my clock. I don't want to go too long. Thank you for coming this morning. I know the clocks are reset. Before I get to too much, hang on. See if I can get my slides to show up. Before I get to too much, I do want to apologize. I'm an engineer. I'm a researcher. I am not a public speaker. So I'll do my best. Oops, see? Bit closer, okay. See, they're already telling me where to stand. Who am I? Like everybody else, I put up the CV of who I am. You can read that if you want to. Basically, I write stuff, I go on radio shows, and I come up with theories. Before I begin, this is a slide I put into every slide deck I've ever done. It's something I firmly believe. Don't believe me or anybody else up here. Don't believe anybody. Do it yourself. Anything that I'm going to tell you is a starting point. It's a starting point only. I want you to go out and take the time to actually figure it out for yourself. Okay, what is the secret space program? Excuse me, I have to read this. To me, I define the secret space fundamentally as a theory, backed up by facts, that a parallel space program exists outside the view or control of the populace. It exists in a multinational space and is supported by most industrialized nations.